Have you heard of fat-breaking chicken? Pick the fattest chicken out of 100 and kill the other 99 chickens in front of it. The chicken will be scared to death, and its fat will also break. Use the most common method to make the dish, and it tastes like heaven. My dad was making the fat-broken chicken. My mom was scared to death. My dad cut open her skin, and her fat stretched from head to toe like cracked webs. The steamer started, and my dad took a deep breath and looked at me behind him. What could be fatter than a fat-broken chicken? My dad opened a chicken restaurant in the village, and the men in the village always come to patronize it. As the new year approaches, more and more people come, and they come more frequently. Someone even secretly asked my dad, "William, will there be fat-free chicken for this year's Thanksgiving dish?" My father sighed and said, "This dish is expensive. It costs a lot, and it's tiring. I won't make it now." Other men in the village also gathered around, praising my father's cooking skills and making him drink a lot of wine. I can't forget William's fat-burning chicken after eating it once. It tastes better than other dishes in the restaurant. I bought the fattest chicken I chose a few years ago. It was really top quality. They started talking about the breed of chicken again, saying that chicken meat tasted better, and they almost came to a fight. My father smiled disdainfully and put his arm around the village chief's shoulder. If you ask me, the best chicken is still the fat-depleted chicken. It has a special and unique aroma that you will never forget once you take a bite. The village chief nodded, nostalgic. The last time we did this was about 20 years ago, right? We had a big fight over the meat and divided up all the chicken eggs. I came over and asked curiously, why not use a rooster to make the fat-breaking chicken? In the countryside, females are kept until they give birth or lay eggs and are much more valuable than males. I don't know if it was because my dad drank too much, but he stared at me with bloodshot eyes. A fat-breaking chicken can only be a female. The villagers tried to persuade and beg my father, and even gave him a large sum of money, all wanting to try the legendary chicken that my father had mentioned. The village chief also said, "Your chicken can no longer be eaten, so why not give it to everyone to satisfy their cravings?" Anyway, she gave birth to a chick. My dad finally relented and agreed to include this dish on Thanksgiving. The men in the village were so happy that it was like Chinese New Year. I was also curious and salivated over this delicacy. When I got home at night, I couldn't wait to share it with my mother. Dad said he's going to make fat-burned chicken for Thanksgiving. Mom, have you ever tried it? Is it as delicious as Dad said? My mother was sewing a pair of cotton trousers with a needle, and she pricked her hand and blood oozed out. Did he let you eat the chicken? My dad didn't say that. My father would not be willing to give us something like this that costs a lot of money. I winked at my mother and said, "When he's done, I'll secretly hide a piece and bring it back so we can eat it together." I heard that the taste is unforgettable for more than 20 years. I wonder how delicious it is. My mother's voice was shaking as she pressed my shoulders tightly. "Remember, don't eat that meat. Don't eat it. Fat-breaking chicken is not a chicken at all." Although my father agreed to cook the chicken, one chicken was obviously not enough for the whole village. If you want to eat chicken, you have to fight for it. The villagers sent chickens one after another, each of which was fat and strong. My dad stood at the door with a book, weighing and counting each chicken. If the chicken didn't pass the test, you had to give him money to buy the right to eat chicken. Some who cannot win the fight try their best to please, hoping to get a mouthful of meat residue and broth, just to have a taste of it. My father made a lot of money, and the chickens sent to him filled up our chicken coop. He carefully wrote down in a notebook how much each family was entitled to. My mother was sitting in the house watching from afar. In the bowl of rice was clean, fresh marinated meat, which she was chewing mechanically. "Mom, when did you start liking this?" I took a bite and immediately spit it out. "It's so disgusting." My mother chewed expressionlessly and didn't answer my question. She held me tightly in her arms when she slept, and the smell of her pickled meat gave me a headache. I couldn't help but push her away and move myself a little further away. I complained in a daze, "Mom, please eat less marinated meat." It smells so bad. My mother hummed softly and patted me lightly with her hands. After the new year, I won't have to eat any more. The backyard of my house is connected to the chicken coop. In the middle is where we live, and in the front close to the road is the restaurant. My dad said that we would kill a lot of chickens during the spring festival, so he built a huge stove outside the chicken coop. As the stove got higher day by day, my mom became more and more anxious. I often saw her panicking and hiding from the people who came to help her at home, eating marinated meat like crazy. She changed the bowl in her hand into a basin, and she would eat several kilograms of meat every day. She smelled of bacon, as if it was emanating from her body. I tried to persuade her, but it was useless. I could only stay away from her. Today, the stove was built, and all the relatives came, but my mother didn't even say hello. Mom, why did you run away when you saw Uncle Air? He called your name the day after tomorrow, and you ignored him. As soon as I got close to my mother, I smelled the aroma of meat, had marinated in a restaurant, but it was more tempting than the one in the store. I couldn't help but take a deep breath and get closer to my mother, wishing I could stick to her. Did you go to the restaurant to help out again today? Did my dad research some new delicious food? My mother didn't say anything, so I pulled her arm and acted coquettishly. You smell so good. Just tell me. I promise not to cheat. My mother ran away again, holding the basin. How strange. It seems that my mother has stopped talking since my father started building the stove. No matter what I asked, she wouldn't answer. Sometimes she would suddenly hug me and not let go for a long time. I suddenly felt panicky, as if my mother was going to leave me at any time. I looked for her all over the yard, and only felt relieved when I saw her hiding in the house. George, come here and help Daddy try out the size. My dad ordered a large pot that matched the stove, which could hold 2 or 3 whole chickens. There was also a large steamer, just arrived today, and it's bigger than the one selling buns in the village. It takes several people to carry my dad's steamer and put it on the pot, and they were busy with this just now. My dad carried me to the stove and said, "Lie down and help Dad to try the size." This airtight box was a great temptation to me. I got in without saying anything and lay flat inside. The steamer was just right for me, as I could stretch my arms and legs straight and open and close them to draw circles. I think if an adult lies down here, he or she probably won't be as comfortable as I am and will need to curl up his or her legs. My dad said that this year the fat broken chicken should be steamed whole, using the most original method to retain the purest and sweetest flavor. When he said this, he was staring straight behind me. I followed his gaze and saw my mother chewing the marinated meat in her mouth. Her expression was exactly the same as the chickens in the chicken coop behind her. The day before Thanksgiving, all the people on the list in the village came to my house. My father had promised to give out a small share, only 20, but I have read his notebook, and it is filled with names of people who want to get a piece of the pie. My father suddenly broke into my door the night before, holding 2 sharp knives in his hands. He pulled me out to wash and cut potatoes, and put them in 2 layers in the steamer, and worked until late at night. I was so tired that my arms ached and my head felt dizzy. I finally lay down on the bed, and just as I closed my eyes, I heard my dad calling me. I opened my eyes and saw that it was actually daybreak. My dad was sitting in the yard sharpening knives, making a lot of noise until the blades were shiny. Beside him were a bunch of knives, big and small, filling up the entire stove. Some of the knives hadn't been used for a long time and were rusty, so my dad found them and was sharpening them one by one. "Dad, what do you do with so many knives?" My father didn't even look up. When you kill a chicken, you have to do it all at once. You can't stop in the middle. If the knife becomes dull, you have to replace it with a new one immediately. Why don't you just buy some new ones? My dad put down the sharpened knife carefully. If you don't use your own knife, you won't be able to scare the fat chicken to death. It was almost noon when my dad finished sharpening the knife. He looked at the sun, asked me to start boiling water in the pot, and closed the gate of the yard fence. The villagers lined up and pulled the chickens out of the chicken coop one by one. My father's knife was sharp, and his technique was very experienced. As soon as the chicken stood in front of him, its neck was cut open in one go. A chicken will not die immediately after its throat is cut, but will struggle violently. Holding the chicken let go, it ran and jumped away, and blood flowed down its fur to the ground and spread everywhere. The chicken has bled almost all out and can no longer run or jump. It will fall to the ground with a bang and scratch around with its still twitching claws. Killing one is okay, but my dad wants to kill 100. One chicken had time to fall. Another would rush out, and the yard soon turned into a crazy scene. All the chickens were jumping around wildly in the circle, and the bodies of the first fallen chickens had already been trampled into meat paste. Another new chicken fell down and turned into new meat paste. All I could hear were the screams of chickens, the laughter of the men in the village, and my father counting continuously. It was like hell on earth. I had never seen such a horrific scene before. I was completely stunned and motionless. Blood splattered on my face, and a chicken rushed towards me, knocking me to the ground. I screamed, hugged my head, and huddled myself next to the stove. My mother hugged me tightly from behind, stroking my head again and again. 98-99, my father's voice suddenly stopped, and the noisy sounds around him seemed to stop as well. The chicken that just fell down seemed to be the last one. So, was the chicken that my dad had chosen frightened to death? Was it trampled into a pulp? I heard a shrill cry of a chicken, so close to me that I trembled all over. At the same time, the weight on my body disappeared. My mother, who was pressing on me, disappeared. I raised my head. My father was standing next to me and gently closed the lid of the steamer. 100. I seemed to see my mother, lying on her side with her legs stretched out through the gap in the lid. I pushed my father away like crazy and lifted the lid of the steamer that he had already closed. Chicken lying on its side without skin or wounds. I reached out to touch it in disbelief, and it was indeed chicken feathers and a little warm. Its eyes were still open, and its pupils were facing sideways, completely different from those of humans. It really was a chicken. I actually had a moment of doubt that my mother had wrapped the chicken skin. My father pulled me off the stove and replaced the lid, instead of scolding me. He explained to the villagers that I had worked all night and did not get enough rest. My dad touched my head and said, "The chicken needs to be steamed until tonight. We don't need you here. Go and have a good sleep." I felt even more dizzy, but I still insisted on holding my dad's hand. "Where's my mom? She was here just now. Why is she gone?" My dad looked at me with a condemning look, as if I was making a fuss. "What are you talking about? Your mother disappeared a few days ago. How could she just appear here?" I explained in a panic, gesturing. I was just knocked down by a chicken, and it was my mom who protected me. She was always by my side. My father pushed me into the house and said, "Silly boy, I think you are sleepy and confused, so you just talk nonsense." Others in the village echoed, "Your mother is such a big person. If she were here, everyone would have definitely seen her." "That's right. You can't talk nonsense on New Year's Day. It's unlucky. How can we adults lie to a little kid like you?" "I'm afraid I'm too tired, and I'm hallucinating." I pulled the clothes from behind and smelled my body, but there was no familiar smell of marinated meat. If my mother had really hugged me tightly for so long, I would definitely have the smell on me. I began to doubt my memory. Could it be that because my mother's disappearance hit me so hard, I created a mother in my imagination? And the reason why my mother refused to communicate with me these days is because I imagined her. My dad looked at me, staring into my eyes. "Go to sleep. When you wake up, maybe you'll understand everything." I was forced to go back to the house and lie on the bed. My head hurt so much, but I couldn't sleep at all. All I could think about was my mother. She couldn't have just left without saying goodbye and left me. If she really hadn't been home for a few days, something must have happened. I'm going to find her. I sneaked out of the yard and asked around in the village like a headless fly. No one had seen my mother, and no one knew where she had gone. "Oh, Your mother doesn't usually go out. We don't see each other for 10 days or half a month. How many days has it been lost? When was it lost? No one has ever told me anything. Your father is really generous. We never saw him looking for anyone. But he brought the goods home in batches. He's been missing for several days and hasn't come back. So he's probably dead. My condolences. My tears flowed, and I covered my face with my hands in embarrassment. The aroma of marinated meat penetrated my nose, which I had smelled from my mother a few days ago. And this hand had just touched the chicken in the steamer. And Annie came over and patted my shoulder. Hey, don't cry. What's that smell? The fragrance in the air became stronger, and many people stopped what they were doing. I saw them all raise their heads in unison, greedily sniffing the air. It smells like William S. Their fat smashed chicken is out of the pot. I brought a few chickens to his house. There must be a share for me. Come on. There are only 20 spots for the chicken dinner, and people went there early in the morning. That's right. I don't think there will be any meat left. Let's go, let's go. We can't eat the chicken, but it would be good to bring back 2 bones to make soup. They all started running towards my house, like a flock of mad chickens, rushing towards me. The ant next to me protected me tightly. We were both knocked to the ground, and someone stepped on her several times. She held me tightly until the crowd dispersed. Thank you, Auntie. I was still in shock. Auntie held on to my shoulders tightly. Her strength was terrifying. George, I just protected you, you know that. Only then did I notice that her eyes were bloodshot, and she was staring at me. Annie fought hard. Otherwise, you would have been trampled to death. I don't want much, just a bite, a small bite of chicken. You are not the kind of ungrateful person, right? I wanted to run, but her grip was too tight, so I could only nod. My aunt pulled my arm and ran to my house in a hurry. There were 3 layers of people at the door of my house. Some even started to climb the wall. There were mostly men, few women, and everyone's expression was as enthusiastic as my aunt's. My aunt pushed my shoulders and sent me to the door, shouting, "Make way." My dad and others were blocking the door. When they saw me, they quickly pulled me in. My aunt reluctantly let go of my hand, and her nails left a bloody mark on my arm. I was gasping for breath. I told you to rest at home, so when did you run outside? The sky in the yard was dark, as black as spilled ink. I turned around and looked outside again. It was dark too. The people who came to my house were crowded together outside. Some were holding flashlights, and some were carrying bowls. But when I just came back, it was still bright outside. What are you standing there for? The steamer in the yard had just been opened, and the whole yard was filled with a fragrant smell. I subconsciously raised my hand and smelled it, and it was exactly the same. The whole chicken was still lying inside, and the village chief and several other people carefully lifted the steamer down. My father held the smallest boning knife in the house and cut through the back of the chicken, along its spine. I could hear the sound of flesh being torn. I moved closer and watched my father poke his finger in and twist it a few times, easily lifting the chicken skin. The yellow fat floats on the top, one strip after another, like a membrane or a net, covering the top of the chicken. The skin was peeled very smoothly, and the fat was all over the chicken, from head to toe. My dad threw the chicken skin on the ground, and I turned my head away immediately. I seemed to hear a clinking sound, like the sound of metal falling to the ground. It was so light that it seemed like my imagination. My dad was particularly happy. This chicken is great. The fat is evenly distributed, and the cracking pattern is beautiful. I haven't seen such a beautiful chicken in years. The village chief and his men were gulping down their saliva, and some of them couldn't help but reach out their hands to grab a piece of chicken to taste. The chicken was steaming, burning their hands so much that they pulled them back, but their eyes became brighter. "William, hurry up. We have been waiting for a whole day. Please stop torturing us." "That's right. I just want to hold the chicken and eat it directly." The chicken's belly was cut open, and the smell of pickled meat became stronger. But the whole body of the chicken was not pickled at all. I started to shiver all over, thinking about how much pickled meat my mother had eaten in the past few days, and the lingering smell of pickled meat on her body, and I felt a chill all over my body. The chicken was cut into pieces. The village chief and his companions each held a piece and huddled in a corner, as if they were afraid of being snatched away by others. They hissed in pain from the heat, but couldn't wait to eat it. My father cut into the chicken's breast and removed a piece of heart for me. The rest of the meat was brown, but that piece of meat seemed uncooked and was oozing with blood. George, you've been busy with Dad all day. Thank you for your hard work. This is the best meat on the chicken. Dad has been thinking about you and has been saving it for you. Eat it now, try it. There was a light in my father's eyes when he looked at me, the same way my aunt looked at me. Thank you, Dad. I've been craving for this for a long time, and I finally got to eat it today. I stuffed all the meat into my mouth in front of him and chewed it with big mouthfuls. My dad watched me swallow the meat and then turn around. The whole chicken had been cut into pieces, and only the chicken head and some internal organs were left. My father held the chicken head devoutly and kissed its mouth. Then he grabbed the upper jaw and chin of the chicken's head and broke it hard, splitting the head in half. He bit off half of the chicken tongue in one bite, eating it with a smacking sound. He leaned sideways, almost half facing away from me, but I didn't dare to relax. He was still looking at me out of the corner of his eyes. I suppressed my nausea and showed my dad a greedy expression. The village chief and his men didn't want to waste any meat, so they all ate until their bellies were full and collapsed on the ground. My dad didn't seem to have any interest in the meat. He just ate a few bites, and there was no crazy or addicted look on his face. He was as calm as I was. The bones were collected and put into a big pot and stewed with the water from the chicken to make a pot of soup. My father took out his notebook and started to fulfill his promise. Who comes to the house to give chickens and money can get a portion of potatoes with chicken on top and a bowl of soup made from chicken bones. He asked me to make this pot of potatoes this morning, and it turns out this is what they are going to be used for. Everyone brought their own bowls and lined up in a hurry. My aunt, who helped me, stood at the outside drooling. I told my dad that I wanted to help, and he was very happy. Put potatoes on the bottom of the bowl and add a spoonful of chicken soup, all according to the portion. Chicken bone after eating. Annie pushed the bowl to me, and the potatoes I served her took up the whole bowl, with only a thin layer of soup. She glared at me with resentment, walked away, flipped over the chopsticks, turned back in surprise, and kept bending to thank me. My dad looked at me with a scrutinizing gaze, and I turned away in surprise. "What's wrong, Dad?" Was still blood in my mouth from the chicken I had just eaten. My father shook his head. "The women in the village are not worthy of eating such good food. Next time someone comes to ask you for help, tell me, will we cook chicken again in our family? Who will be the next chicken?" The last smooth chicken bones in the pot were also shared, and everyone was very satisfied. I volunteered to stay and help my dad clean up the mess, and secretly hid the chicken skin in the house. The smell on the chicken skin was not strong, and you couldn't smell it unless you got close to it. I wasn't afraid of my dad finding out. I crawled on the chicken skin and searched inch by inch, and finally found a key in a knotted ball of hair. The key looked very old, rusty in some places, and felt a little greasy. I have seen this key. My father almost always carries it with him. It is used to open the back kitchen of my house. My dad never lets me go in there. He drank with the village chief today and went to bed drunk. So now, isn't it the best opportunity for me? I slipped into my dad's room and took a look. He was snoring loudly and was soundly asleep. The kitchen door lock had long been rusty, and I opened the door with shaking hands. The kitchen was very large, larger than our room, and it was very clean, almost too clean. There were no common seasonings, oil, salt, sauce, or vinegar on the table, only 2 chopping boards. I leaned over to take a look and found that there were no cut marks on them. My father had always used clay stoves, which were neatly arranged in the kitchen. There was no grease on them, and even the passage for storing firewood was not blackened by fire. It was as if it had never been used. By a sudden crowing of a rooster in the corner. Then I noticed that there were 2 cages in the corner of the kitchen. The cage contained a very thin woman with a bulging belly, and in the cage next to her was a fat chicken. Chicken crows one after another from her mouth. Next to me lay there without moving, their horizontal eyes looking at me warily from time to time. The woman was very anxious. Her face was full of tears. She held my hand tightly, unwilling to let go. I think she looks a bit like my mother. Can you write? Don't worry. Write it for me. I know simple words. But she shook her head and started gesturing, pointing at herself and then at the chicken, and then made a gesture of wiping her neck. You mean to say that I will turn into a chicken and be eaten? The woman nodded vigorously and bowed to me with her hands, as if begging me to save her. I looked at her bulging belly and her face that looked like my mother's, and I felt a little bit sorry for her. The cages are locked. Wait for me. I'll go home and get a pair of pliers. The woman nodded vigorously, stroking her belly with a smile on her face. I ran out of the door, locked the door again, and ran into my dad when I came back. He smelled of alcohol and stared at me with his bull eyes. You went into the kitchen? I smiled sheepishly while holding the pliers. I didn't eat enough at night, so I'm a little hungry. I asked you to, but you didn't agree. So I wanted to come in and find something to eat by myself. My dad looked at me and reached into his pocket. I almost broke out in a cold sweat because the key was in my hand. He paused for a moment, took out the key from his pocket, and opened the door. I didn't dare to follow him in. I just stood at the door and tried to look inside. The kitchen was completely different from what I had just seen. Next to the stove was old grease that had not been cleaned yet. There were some marinated meats and condiments on the table, and the walls were much darker than what I had just seen. Chickens locked up inside. I suddenly remembered that my father once mentioned to the village chief that they made fat-breaking chicken 20 years ago. The chicken was a female and was pregnant. Could the woman I just saw be the chicken? But how is that possible? That was 20 years ago, even earlier than I was born. But the key was in my hand, and I could feel it pressing against the palm of my hand when I exerted force. Everything I saw was real. My father took 2 pieces of cake from the kitchen and gave them to me, and told me to go back to bed early. I wanted to go to the kitchen again, but I saw my dad went to the backyard and dragged the chicken that he had killed today into the kitchen. He was preparing food for the next day and didn't plan to go to sleep. I took the 2 cakes back to the room and found that my palms were full of sweat. I took out the key and found that it seemed newer and had less rust. Since I started selling fat-breaking chicken, my business has improved, and there are many people coming every day. The strange thing was that my dad cooked pot after pot of chicken, but didn't open the door to do business. The villagers outside were so anxious that they banged on the door. My dad would stay in there almost till dawn every day, and he was very busy. I don't know why my dad worked so hard. The money my dad made this time was equal to what we had earned in the previous 2 years. So why did he still work so hard? Dad, we cooked so much chicken. Why don't you open the door? My dad looked outside the door, where there were villagers trying to break into my house. After eating fat-breaking chicken, you can't eat any more chicken for 7 days. Otherwise, my dad glanced at me and suddenly waved his hand impatiently. Anyway, they will come to our house and eat a lot in 7 days, so we need to prepare more goods. This is the best time to make money. I have a hunch that 7 days is very important. I must go to the kitchen again to take a look. I asked my aunt to buy some things for me from outside. She waited outside our door every day, looking forward to seeing me, hoping to get something from me based on our relationship. I thought it was good that she had to give back everything she did. I promised my aunt that I would steal some chicken from home for her. In the evening, I handed a few not-so-good-looking steamed buns to my father and looked at him expectantly. Dad, I made this myself. Do you want to try it and see if it tastes good? My father fell asleep not long after he finished eating. I rocked him back and forth, and his head hit the table several times, but he didn't wake up. I took the key from the house and opened the kitchen door impatiently. The woman in the cage was gone, only a chicken, lying motionless in the cage. I went over to call it, but it didn't respond at all. The kitchen stove had been used, and I looked around the kitchen and found a chicken tail hanging next to the window. This chicken tail still has hair on it, as if it was cut off in one piece. It has now dried, and I can see yellow oil on it. Yellow oil? I leaned over and touched the chicken feathers with my hands, then put my hands under my nose. It was the smell of marinated meat mixed with the aroma of meat. I was too late. The woman had been killed. I closed the door and opened it again, and the kitchen became what it originally was in my home. I took out the key and took a look, and it looked newer. I stole a piece of chicken from the kitchen and gave it to my aunt, who smiled and said she would help me later. I found that there was also a chicken tail hanging above the kitchen in my house. I broke the meat from the chicken tail, and inside was a net-like layer of yellow fat. I suddenly remembered that my mother seemed to have drunk a bowl of chicken tail soup before she ate the marinated meat like crazy. The next day, my dad woke up and found me lying on the table with a half-eaten steamed bread in my hand. My dad looked at me with scrutiny, and I apologized to him and said I lied. I didn't make the steamed bread. My aunt gave it to me. She said that after eating the steamed bread, you can have a good rest. I want you to have a good rest. My father looked at me for a long time and sighed. He wanted to settle the score with his aunt first, but he went to my kitchen first and started checking the things in the kitchen. I peeked at the door and found that my father went to check the chicken tail first. He peeled off the skin and breathed a sigh of relief when he saw the yellow oil inside. I was also glad that I didn't steal the tail out on impulse yesterday. My father went to check the meat he had cooked again, and when he opened one of the pots, he sneered. A rat got into our kitchen and stole the meat. I shuddered all over and felt that my father was a monster. He cooked 20 or 30 pots of meat in the past 2 days, and I randomly took a small piece, only as big as rock candy. If I were to look at it myself, I wouldn't even know which pot of meat I took. How did he figure that out? What should we do? Aren't we not allowed to eat chicken within 7 days? My dad put the lid on the food. Don't worry, this is fate. Being greedy will always cost you something. In the evening, the village chief sent 2 chickens to my house, 1 male and 1 female. He sighed. More and more people have been missing recently. Someone went there early in the morning and found that Emma's house was empty. I saw 2 chickens running around, so I just brought them to your place. Emma is my aunt's name. Adding 2 more chickens to your chicken restaurant. The village chief changed the subject and looked at my dad with a smile. Your family has been cooking chicken again these 2 days. Can you let me, your elder brother, taste a few bites first? My father did not give the meat to the village chief either. Village chief. This rule was set by my father 20 years ago, and he told me to abide by it. Don't worry, I'll keep the fugan this time too. When the chicken grows up in the next few years, I promise to call you first. The village chief reluctantly left. Okay, there are still a lot of things to do in the village. I have to find out where Emma and the others have gone. Emma is very agile, but her husband has been paralyzed in bed for so many years. How come he also disappeared? His wheelchair is still at home. My dad watched me very closely and wouldn't eat anything I gave him. Fortunately, he still needed sleep. My dad let his guard down on the last day, and I snuck into the kitchen. I saw someone I didn't expect to see in there. It was my mom. She was kneeling in the cage. Her mouth was blocked, and there was a chicken in the cage next to her. I ran over and took the cloth out of her mouth. My mother's tears suddenly flowed down, her lips trembling, shivering, and she hugged me through the cage. The smell on her body had not yet turned into the smell of meat, but the pungent smell of pickled meat that I was familiar with. I also hugged her tightly, tears streaming down my face. Mom, can you speak? My mother shook her head, pointed at the chicken next to her, and then pointed at her throat. My tears flowed even harder, but my mother grabbed my hand and wrote on it, stroke by stroke. Don't eat chicken. Eat chicken within 7 days after eating fat-breaking chicken. You will turn into a chicken. Let them eat, I said quickly. But today is the 7th day, and my dad cooked a lot of chicken at home. He stared at me and he wouldn't eat it at all. My mother wrote again, "Eat cocktails. Yes, the chicken tail is also considered a part of the fat-breaking chicken. But my dad won't let me into the kitchen. He has a plan for the amount of meat in each pot. How can I add the cocktail in?" I told my mother about the meat the other day. My mother pointed at the kitchen stove and wrote the word tang on my hand. I shook my head. The fat-breaking chicken is so fragrant that my dad would definitely find out if I were to make soup at home. Maybe he wouldn't find out here, but I didn't dare to stay that long. My mother touched my head and asked me to get 2 bowls from the kitchen. She used a knife to put her own blood and the blood of the chicken next to her into half a bowl and smiled at me. The keys in my hand were getting newer and newer. I looked at my mother and asked, "Can I see you next time I come here?" My mother nodded. "How many times can I come back?" She raised 2 fingers to me without hesitation. After 7 days, just as my dad said, more people came to our chicken restaurant. All the chicken my dad cooked was eaten up that day. They all ate until their bellies were full, and I was so busy that I had to run to serve the dishes. "Dad, it's a good thing you prepared the dishes in advance. Otherwise, I wouldn't be able to keep up." My dad hummed and kept sniffing. "Do you smell anything?" I also raised my head and sniffed carefully. "It smells a bit like the chicken stew I had a few days ago." I shook my head again after saying that. "It's not that fragrant at all, Dad. Are other restaurants imitating our way of making fat-broken chicken?" My dad showed a look of disdain on his face. "They can't make it. Only our family can make this chicken." Although my dad said this, he still went to the kitchen to check the chicken tail. It was now well dried and hard to the touch. My dad took it off and carefully placed it in a jar. I don't know where he hid it. The next day and the day after, my family's business was still booming. The village chief and his men came to my house and insisted on asking my father to drink. My father couldn't refuse, so I went to the kitchen to bring out the remaining chicken. I used a spatula to stir the meat a few times, scooped it out, and placed it in front of them, watching them eat it bite by bite. The village chief pointed his finger and said, "This chicken tastes really good, so fragrant." "Yeah, it's a bit like the fat-breaking chicken we ate a few days ago. William is really kind, saving the best for us." "Good, brother. Let's do it." I saw my father's face change. He sniffed the chicken again and again, and even got up and went out in the middle. I knew he was going to check the cocktails. I quietly followed him out. My dad came back relaxed, and I also brought a few bottles of wine in. This time he ate with big mouthfuls, and I laughed too. After the village chief and his friends left, my dad shook his head and went into the kitchen to start cooking chicken for the next day. Today's chicken was made by my dad himself. He sniffed it again and again with an intoxicated expression on his face. I watched him take out a piece of meat and put it in his mouth, smacking his lips a few times at the end. He has become very accustomed to the taste. In the past few days, I repeatedly added the blood given by my mother to the chicken he cooked, hoping that they would turn into chickens. But they didn't. Chicken blood only seems to enhance the flavor of the dish, making it very close to the taste of fat-depleted chicken. The real medicine is still the chicken tail. My dad didn't cook much chicken today, but so many people came that they almost fought over this pot of chicken. The incident of not being able to eat the fat-free chicken before, saying that my father was not kind and only thought about making money all day. My dad had no choice but to fill the pot with water, chop the chicken into pieces, and give each person a portion. This time at least there was soup and meat, and everyone in the village was very happy with the meal. My dad made a few more pots the next day, his eyes shining. He recently allowed me into the kitchen, and when his back was turned, I added white vinegar to the pot and shouted, "Dad, is our soup going bad? I smell something sour in it." This pot of soup has been simmering for decades, and my father treasures it very much. He came over and smelled it, frowning as if he didn't believe it. He drank some more soup and took a bite of the meat. "It's broken. It's really broken. Is it because the weather is too hot?" "It was placed like this before. Why is it like this, Chuckle? My father touched his throat in disbelief and stared at me again, his eyes slowly turning sideways. I picked up the rice spoon and shouted to the people outside, sending out portions of meat. I was so happy when I saw them finish eating all the meat and walk out one by one. My dad had already started walking on his stomach, but I ignored him and quickly went back to the house to get the key and pliers, then opened the kitchen door. My mother was the only one in the cage, and the chicken was gone. When she saw me, she was not happy but anxious. I used pliers to open the lock for her. She tried to come over and pull my hand a few times. George, listen to Mom. It's not convenient today. Come back another day. Of course I didn't believe her expression and actions, and of course I didn't listen. The lock wouldn't open no matter what I did. I had tried many times at home, and it only took one try. There wasn't even a crack on the lock. I tried harder and was exhausted. My mother pushed me hard and said anxiously, "Run quickly. Why are you wasting time here? You still have one chance. Come back to save me next time." I smiled bitterly. "Mom, you've been lying to me from the beginning. I figured it out. Every time I go back to the same place, I can only go back to an earlier time in the past. When I first went back, I thought the woman had been killed, but she hadn't. The tail and the chicken were still there. When I went back the second time, she hadn't been put in the cage yet. Same to you. When I first came, I didn't know what time it was, but you must have eaten the chicken tail and started eating the marinade and garlic. You couldn't speak anymore. You were just like that woman. When you opened your mouth, you would crow like a chicken. So when I came back this time, you were still able to speak, and you were locked up here, and you didn't have time to drink the soup, right?" The more I talked, the more my mother shook her head. She burst into tears. "Go, go. Mom, why?" My mother screamed, "It's all fate. It's all fate." The door was opened, and my dad was standing outside, holding a fat chicken in his hand, looking at me in surprise. I threw the tongs in my hand to my mom, grabbed the knife on the chopping board, and rushed towards him. I was ruthless, and my father didn't dodge the first time, so I cut a hole in his stomach. He knocked me to the ground violently. Killing chickens for cooking all year round made my dad very strong. He punched me in the nose and it bled. It hurt so much. My mom screamed and picked up the pliers I had thrown away and was trying to open the lock on the cage. She kept calling my name and saying I was disobedient. My father kicked me to the door and almost kicked me out of the kitchen. I clung to the door and crawled back. My mother screamed, "There is still one chance. I didn't lie to you. If the time is earlier, I will just live well." My knife was kicked away by my dad, and he looked at the two of us with a crazy look. "You two bitches, you found out my secret. Don't even think about escaping. I'm going to turn all of you into chicken." My father stepped on my chest and picked up the cocktail soup on the table and was about to pour it into my mouth. My mother finally rushed out of the cage. She picked up the knife on the ground and slashed my father's neck. She also helped my father kill chickens. The bowl in my father's hand fell. He looked up in disbelief and covered his neck with his hands. My mother cried and pushed me out the door. I held her hand and pulled her out of the door despite the severe pain. The skin on my arm was torn, and the key in my hand disappeared, but I smiled happily. I made the right bet. "Mom, before you drank this bowl of soup, you would never be locked in the kitchen by my dad. This is the first time you have been locked here. Once I leave this door, I can never come back. Even if you were alive in the past, I wouldn't be able to save you. This is my only chance to save you." My mother burst into tears, and suddenly a chicken jumped out from the yard and tried to butt us angrily. My mother stopped him and looked back at me, as if for confirmation. "Yes, Dad, I did it. George Extra. I discovered that chicken blood couldn't replace chicken tails. I had other ideas. It has a very similar smell and can be used to create smoke bombs or to numb my dad's sense of smell and taste." After being on high alert several times, he finally let down his guard. In fact, I also thought about how to add such a chicken tail into the dish without being noticed. Later, I decided to grind it into powder. Fortunately, my father chose to dry it and preserve it, so I succeeded without much effort. The men in the village ate it bite by bite, and my heart was trembling with excitement. The next day, my dad cooked a pot of chicken. I secretly poured a little vinegar into it and told him that the chicken tasted strange. My dad ate it. He became the first chicken in our house. Then there was a second one, a third one. I drove all the stray chickens in the village back into the pen. My mother said that it was irreversible to turn a person into a chicken, but we knew what these were. I contacted a farm, sold all the chickens in my house, and bought a new batch. After a few months, the chicken shop reopened, and this time, my mother was the chef herself. When the men in the village disappeared, everyone was panicked. My house was surrounded by people, and they all asked where my mother had been and how she got back. My mother said that she went up the mountain to collect herbs, but broke her leg. She was unconscious in the mountains for a while, and only came down the mountain after her leg healed. It's so cold during the New Year. If he had fainted in the mountains, he would have frozen to death. Didn't they prepare a small house on the mountain? Maybe someone rescued him. Some people believe this statement, while others do not. My mother just smiled and advised them the same thing everyone had advised me. If he hasn't come back for a few days, he's probably dead. I'm sorry,